All right. Hello, everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG architecture meeting for September 5th, 2024. And I think we're just going to probably reserve all the time to talk about the one item that David Eads raised in the mailing list. So I think most folks on the call probably have read that. I hope so. There's been a fair bit of discussion there. So I'm just going to hand it right on over to David.
Sure. So this came out of, it's hard to even say what it was. I guess probably what Tim had been talking about a year ago has just been noodling around in my head. Like how are users supposed to know what is GA, what is beta, what is our appetite to actually make breaking changes, and where do we end up from a practical perspective? It it came up fairly recently at the API machinery call when we had a change for validating emission policy. And it was a change to fixed validation where we had shipped an accident. We had forgotten to account for some sort of one variant of performance checking, right? This is a restriction we needed. And there was a discussion of, well, if it was still in beta, we would just change this. And on that call, I think both Jordan and I at the same time said, oh, no, we wouldn't. If it was in beta and we had released this into the world and there was a release that did not account for this, we would not tighten validation to break people. We would go through the same hoops we're going through now to be sure that we don't explicitly break people. And that reaction, surprising to me, surprised other people. And so, I've been thinking about that over time, and I came up with this list, right, of qualities that people expect, right? Where if you're on by default in production, your testing is complete, it is safe to rely upon, cube maintainers will not change the behavior of what you're working with, and we are extremely unlikely to remove the functionality that we have in there. And I guess maybe that's like a good pausing point to see whether the approach of, well, no, we're not going to break a beta just because it says beta is something people here expected or not, and whether they think that's right or not, because I guess a lot flows from that position. And actually, Han already has a hand. So yeah, Han. Oh, Han got shy.
Yeah. No, I lowered it because you picked me. So I don't understand how this would be different than just ratcheting the requirements for beta, because the semantics for beta to the user are still different. Specifically, you can turn off the feature. And in the going to directly to GA, now you basically have GA with a bifurcated state. And I just don't see how that's better for the user.
Okay, and so this is the viewpoint that says this is already the state that we have. We just call our first GA beta.
Yeah. I'm saying, like, you get exactly what you want. We just call it beta.
I think maybe. So I actually am somewhat unsure. Like after that conversation at API Machinery, I'm somewhat unsure how many people either do or do not agree with the notion that betas are very unlikely to change behavior. They are not likely to break over upgrade, and we are extremely unlikely to remove them. And since I specifically called out Jordan previously, I think I'll choose Jordan to go next.
Yeah, I when for the particular case, like, validating mission policy didn't enforce some cost stuff. I think I was saying we wouldn't change the behavior of the beta, but we would become more strict on the promotion to GA. Like the the next version of the thing would require we would validate it more strictly. So that's similar to what we did with custom resource definitions, right? In the beta, you didn't even have to give us a schema. And we realized, oh, that's a mistake like that. But we didn't break the beta. When we promoted to GA, we said, okay, now when you're writing to the V1 API, you actually do have to give a schema. So we maintained compatibility with the beta stuff. People who were writing against the beta API did not break. All those beta API requests kept working, but the beta had a time limit on it and eventually went away, and they had to shift to the GA API. And at that point, they had to fit within whatever the stricter, better validation of the GA API was.
That's true.
So
that was brutal in the ecosystem, but that is true.
Yeah. So saying we wouldn't break a beta is not the same as saying we will keep the problematic beta behavior forever. So I just wanted to draw that distinction.
So you're making the point that that having a separate beta in GA gives an opportunity to correct a mistake that is not identified until GA.
Yeah,
that is not identified
until we identified more mistakes like that when betas were on by default and got wide usage, which had its own set of problems. But yes, that boundary, like it was beta, now it's GA, the beta will go away in a year. You have to switch to the GA API. Like that boundary is an opportunity to make improvements effective and required.
I believe
I'm next. So Jordan, you just really highlighted this case, but I want to call it out that one of the big problems we have here is this sort of disconnect between beta means we can change the API and we have saved state. Anybody who has used these things has written something to their API server, and that thing is persistent, and we have to respect it. We can't start exploding on the thing that they've saved. And many times in many PRs, I have to remind people of that sequence of events before they realize why we do some of the things that we do with respect to validation or just hoop jumping, to make sure that we don't explode saved state. And when we talk about betas here, maybe we should be clear whether we're talking about net new beta APIs or beta fields in a GA API, because they are two different things that have two different sets of controls and information available at different points in the life cycle.
Yeah, or new behaviors that aren't even surfaced in an API, that are just like, here's a new control loop that's unproven yet. Let's call it beta until it's proven. Yeah, agree.
Yeah. So I actually like the behavior of brand new beta APIs. The behavior I struggle with is the behavior of new beta fields and new beta features that don't get reflected in the API at all.
So for those, like, is it on by default or not? I agree, is sort of the watershed moment. Like a new field and an existing stable API, like it's nice, it's interesting that you called it beta, but practically once it's enabled by default and we let you persist data in it, is there really any difference between that and GA? Probably not.
So there's no indication to the user that there's a difference because they're using the V1 of the API, right? Like they don't know.
Exactly. They copy something from a blog post and they use it and it worked and it didn't give them any warnings and it didn't say beta anywhere and it didn't make them confirm what they were doing. It is, for all intents and purposes, GA. And once we've saved it, we can't go back on that. And even Jordan has kept me honest a couple times with regard to changes in serialization, like non-obvious changes in what gets serialized and what doesn't get serialized between JSON and Proto are different. And type changes, you can't change the type of a field for a given name or given proto tag once you've put it out, even if you called it alpha. Sorry, it was an int at the beginning, it's an int forever.
Yeah. So if we sort of split the streams into like entire endpoints, that's one discussion thread. New fields and existing types, that's another discussion thread. And new behaviors that aren't surfaced in the API. I think the new fields and new behaviors are the ones where David's proposal is most relevant.
Jared, how does this tie in with like feature gates on the command line, or that people switch on and off?
Feature gates are the mechanism that we use today, and there's two dimensions to those. There's the stability level, which we're like, first release is alpha, second release is beta, and then at the earliest, the third release is GA. So that's the stability level. And then there's, does it default on or off? And typically always we default alphas off. Typically we default betas on, and then typically we lock GA on. And if we're saying like the beta phase is not particularly useful for just fields or behaviors, maybe we drop that, but then we have to sort of renegotiate, like, well, we still probably want it to be able to be disabled in the first release at least as a mitigation. So if we're saying, oh, it's GA, it's default on, but this is the first time it's been default on, we kind of need an escape hatch. So if it blows something up, like we've just noticed in a couple of things, like people need to be able to opt back out. So then you get into like, oh, it's GA, but it might not be on in a given cluster if someone turned it off to mitigate something. Like that's a pretty weird state, actually. So in my mind, like the beta, the most useful thing about the beta phase is it may or may not be on in a given cluster. Like we might default it on because we think it's good, but then we might actually go back and default it back off if we find a problem, or someone might toggle it back off as a mitigation. Like we think it's good, but we haven't locked it on yet. That's the main distinctive in my mind.
Right. So nobody can sort of depend on it being there. They have to be. Right.
Well, but in practice, people do.
Yet. You can't write.
But people do, right? People accidentally.
So Jordan, like the whole thing is, I've added a field to pod, and people will rely on this field in pod, even though we are able to turn that back off.
I mean,
because
like
in practice, nobody does.
Literally,
this faces to me
in the sidecar feature where we're like, oh, 129 and up have problems with init containers, and a mitigation is turning off the sidecar feature. Like, would we just tell people, sorry, it was beta, you shouldn't turn that feature gate off? Wait for the fix? Like, I don't know how to solve that problem. If you take away people's ability to turn it off.
I'm not saying to take that away. I'm saying that pretending that people just tend to turn this off as a regular course, you might find a cluster that doesn't have that. That doesn't happen. People usually don't even have control of their feature gates. And so you might find a few outliers where we have turned it off. But by and large, that case isn't, I don't think that's there.
So I think to me, this kind of begs something else that was brought up in the mailing list discussion, is the idea of enthusiastic consent. I think Tim called it, right? Like where, and of course you can't guarantee it ever, but like one of the things we do in PRR with like CLI, people always get annoyed with me for pushing back on this, but I make them put an environment variable in, or the flag doesn't work. And they're like, but the flag says it's alpha. It's like, I don't care. I want the user to acknowledge I'm doing something that enthusiastically and not acknowledge they're doing an alpha thing. And, similarly, like our current API mechanisms for managing beta features or alpha features for that matter, alpha fields in current V1 APIs, they don't have any aspect of enthusiastic consent. And it was raised like, why don't we make people put a header? And yes, people could work around, just like they could put the environment variable in their bash RC. They could automatically use some wrapper that adds this header, but like we can't protect against complete idiocy. Like some enthusiastic consent to me seems to solve some of this. One of these, like we had the 3 different threads, like on one of those threads, that seems to be a way to solve that problem. And I'm curious of other people's opinions on that.
I mean, I think I'm on the record as being strongly in support of that direction. I don't know exactly how to enact it. And I acknowledge, the concerns that Brendan and others have raised around making people jump through hoops. If you do it too much, they'll just always jump through the hoops, right? They'll always set the allow beta flags, and then it goes back to being meaningless. But also, like you said, we can't prevent total idiocy. We can only put it in people's face.
I mean, you can make it even more painful, like where you have to say in your header, there's a header for this specific feature saying I'm enabling this beta feature. Like basically, instead of, you could even do it for APIs, whole endpoints, right? Rather than putting it in the API version manifest, maybe the only thing that lives in the manifest API version are GA endpoints. And if you have a beta endpoint, you got to put a header on that says I want to make use of this endpoint.
So I'm suspicious of this. Like I believe that the majority of people who would build tools to use this would just find a way to always have the thing apply, so that people can use the functionality. And I suspect that everyone on the call everyone in the thread who says, I want to have beta so that people will use it, and they'll be upset if it actually works and nobody uses it. Like they'll be angry at us for making an enthusiastic consent that works. And then we'll be faced with the same problem where sort of like that conversation we had a few weeks back, John, where it was like, we want people to try a thing. We want to encourage them to try it so they can tell us what's wrong, so that we can then break them as thank you for trying it early. And it sounds a lot like that, and it seems like a tough sell to me. Like I don't think it'll do what we want it to do.
I think I agree with your assessment, but I actually think the outcome is working as intended. I think if you're not willing to set the -- enable unstable features, this is going to break you, kaboom flag, then you shouldn't, your appetite for risk isn't the one that we're looking for. And as a feature developer, it's sort of, unfortunately, it's on us to figure out who can I talk into trying this feature so that I can build confidence so that we can use it. And if you look at other communities, like let's look at Linux. And again, I don't like to draw all the analogies to the Linux community, but the way that new things work in Linux is you download a patch, you build your own kernel, and you try it, or you pull from a non-main tree and you try it. That's enthusiastic consent.
Yeah, I think I brought this up for those who were at the contributor summit last time. I just don't believe anybody who's a passerby is going to spend any time with alpha or features that aren't enabled by default.
So it's not alpha, it is features that are not enabled by default, right? Like,
yeah.
And so like I bet we'd be having a very different conversation if GKE and Azure and EKS by default just started disabling beta. And one might ask, like, well, why not? Does Google think it's best practice to enable beta features in their production environments? Maybe. Nope. I don't know.
So my point was, I was sort of agreeing with Tim that I think it's on the feature developer to put in the hard work to get people to try the feature and try out the UX, and that frankly, most of that probably needs to be done in an alpha type environment where they can break them and where they're working with a customer that has the appetite for that risk. And yeah, that's really hard work. And it's, as engineers, we're like, really, that's something product managers kind of are there for. And so for those rare features that are just some random drive-by, then that might not happen. But most features in Kubernetes, I would contend, are driven by one of the people in this room's customers, and we could work with those customers to get the feedback we need. Now, ideally, we work with each other's customers, like we all work on a feature together, because my customers are not the same as your customers and might want something different. And so we might want to see if there's something we can do as a community, as an organization project to help coordinate that kind of thing. But I don't see it happening any other way. Antonio.
So regarding to what David said, I can guarantee you that our beta quality right now in the project is not ready for production. We have regressions. We had to downgrade features that broke the cluster. And one thing is that it patches our testing, another thing is that runs in production scene. So we are far of being executing on this. But my question is for right now, is anybody wants to skip beta? Why is the problem that they need to wait one release for the beta scene? Or is the problem that they cannot get agreement to start in beta directly and go to GA? I'm just trying to understand to put the problem in perspective, because
I think we don't have principles that guide people down that path, and rather than derive principles every KEP, we just say just go alpha, beta, GA, like it's fine. But I think there are a lot of features that we introduce that are fairly simple and self-evident that we have to go through alpha because of the dark launch rollback requirements, and that if not for that, we probably wouldn't even bother. That can go alpha to GA, but we just don't have clear, like, if you fit in this box, then you can do that.
But I mean, what I'm trying to say, is this a whole problem or is it a specific problem? Because I mean, if there are certain features that the SIG considers, okay, this is a feature that I'm confident, right? That this is just need a beta GA, two releases cycle. Why don't we can do that, right? And experiment with that instead of. But the problem is that I see that there is a lot of risk of moving what we have today. It's not the better thing, but it's what we have, and in certain way, it kind of works.
I think that there are a lot of people that don't realize that when they hit that beta and turn it on by default, their feature is pinned. So whatever you had in that field, that's what's going to be valid forever, right? Because you'll have upgraded clusters. That means you're going to have whatever special handling you need in the controller that handles that new field to exist forever. I don't think that everyone understands that when they go to beta.
Okay, so then to try to focus, we are more concerned about the quality of the APIs and to be sloppy on the APIs, and we may need to be more strict on that, is what you're saying?
I would really like it to be the case that a production cluster runs with very reliable features. And so disabling a beta by default or recommending that you only run GA features in production could be a way to do this. But if we were to do that, the question becomes, how different is beta? What's it good for?
Okay, I think that what you're trying to say is that the contracting methods are really strong contracts, and it should be treated as GA APIs, except as no, we clearly broke something and we need to.
I think on by default in production, which is what effectively our beta is today, needs to be a very high bar.
Nobody's disagreeing there, right? I mean, the question I have here is, it took us a long time to get everybody in the user community to understand our alpha, beta, and beta, on or off, and then GA, that whole process, and then the alpha, beta, GA APIs. It's going to be difficult to like say, oh, this feature just went from alpha to GA, or none of the features go from there's only one alpha and there's no beta. It's going to be difficult to make that happen. Like now the question I also have is like, who are we trying to optimize this for? Like, are we trying to optimize it for ourselves because we made some misses where we didn't do exactly what you just said, David, which is having strong assurances that the beta API sticks and backwards compatible, whatever, right? So is it for ourselves or is it for the end users? Like, what is the confusion in end users today that we are trying to tackle, if at all?
I think that the only boundary that ends up mattering is whether it's on by default in most clusters or not. That all the other boundaries make us feel better, but don't change the usage in the world. Oh, Tim St. Clair has had his hand up, so I will yield to him. Or, sorry, I made someone else nervous. I'm sorry.
We've always treated beta very special for a long time, but there's nothing that prevents us from just promoting within beta and deprecating your previous promotions over time. And like we've done that because that's the guidelines said the number of cycles to promote your or to get rid of your other ones, right? So the number, I think it's 2 releases or 3 releases. It's been so long since I've looked at it. So if you do beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, beta 4, until you actually get your API the way you want it to, like it's not like you're going to wait until you get to promotion to GA before you do your final incantation of your API. You'll go through a natural cycle, which will get mileage. Users do want stability in their main APIs 100%. Like they will not turn on features, or they'll have admission control webhooks to disable certain things, to disallow them. But the current context is something that people do understand. They're not naive to this, and they've literally eaten it many times. So, and I've gotten earfuls for it, especially the beta changes that cause breaking things over the years. And so it is a known quantity. I think if you change the paradigm now, you open up another Pandora's box of things that could occur, like promoting something too fast.
So the concern that I have most, the one to the question of what is the outcome that I'd like to see here, I want to know that if a user sets a field, that field is either GA or they did it on purpose. And with the state of things today, if there's a beta gate and we know that the quality of beta things vary, and maybe we can go fix that, but they can use it by accident. They can copy and paste it from a blog and they can use it. And then if it explodes on them, they call us and they say, WTF Google or WTF Kubernetes, I used this feature and it exploded my cluster. And then we have to explain to them that was a beta feature, which feels like an excuse to us, but isn't really an excuse for that. It doesn't excuse the result. So that is my primary concern. And it's not just users, it is the developer community here too. Like putting something in beta is often an excuse to sort of have cut some corners or not have the tests quite where you want it to be. And so part of the proposal that I wrote previously was adding a rule that says when you move from beta or from preview to GA, you can't change the API. You can't change things. It has to be effectively a rename, or maybe we allow the sorts of bugs that we would have allowed to be fixed in a GA product, but it can't be any sort of structural change.
Tim, can I ask, when you say, are you talking here about whole endpoints or just about, because with whole endpoints, you've got the beta in the API version, or you're just talking about fields on existing?
I'm mostly talking about fields on existing APIs. That we do that, in my experience anyway, 10 to 50 times more frequently than we add new API endpoints.
Tim, what you just said, I think we can layer on exactly what we have already, right? We are just holding people more accountable and making them do more work by the time the beta is on by default or switch to true. So that seems like a doable thing rather than getting rid of beta altogether, right?
At that point, if you're saying that all betas must be GA quality, why not just call it GA? Why confuse our users by calling it beta?
So we are trying to differentiate
You'll never
between
get
the
GA
field.
quality without revision and feedback. You'll never get it.
Yeah, and also you're talking about the data versus the behavior that the data comes with, right? You're talking about the persistence of the data itself.
I'm not sure I'm following you, Dims. Like, if I have allowed, go ahead, please.
So you're talking about like whether a field gets correctly persisted and carries over to GA, right? That is what you were talking about, rather than like what the field means, sort of thing.
I mean, all of it. Like, we've defined what the constraints are on the API inputs, and we validated that correctly, which we miss surprisingly often, and that we know what the semantics are, and that the controllers are production worthy, and like all of those things have to be true before we let users accidentally use a feature.
Okay. So at the borderline between a beta is off and beta is on, that is when we enforce it, right?
Well, I guess my thesis is beta is off as preview and beta is on as GA. There's only two states that matter for these kinds of features.
So GA with ability to switch off or not?
That is a fair question. I don't have an answer to.
That's the problem, right? Like,
Well, I think on the first release, we do make it possible to roll back.
Yeah, so we are basically having one more state between a beta and a GA at that point, right?
Except at that point, disabling a GA feature is an exceptional thing, and disabling a beta is not. Like, it's a perception issue. Sorry, Jordan has a hand up forever, so I'm going to stop answering your question.
I've been trying to like write down in the notes like some of the things I hear, and I think we're conflating a lot of different reasons we use this progression, both for stability and for default enablement. Like sometimes the changes have to roll out over multiple versions. So whatever stability level we call it, like it has to exist and be disabled for release, at least a release, and then exist and be enabled. Like it has to be a 2 release rollout.
Yeah.
That could be just the default enablement. Like the stability stuff doesn't come into that at all. It's just has to be off for a release, then on for a release. When we talk about the stability of a feature, there's the stability we think it has, right? Like we have good test coverage and we actually reviewed it really carefully, and we think it's GA, but until like it hits reality and we actually get reports from like real users running it in real clusters, there's always the possibility that someone's like, oh, there's this edge case you didn't consider and it actually broke, right? And so having the first time it's on by default be called GA, like I think Tim St. Clair said, like we don't know until it actually gets into the wild. Like, was it good? We thought it was good. Was it good?
There's always going to be bugs, right? We are always going to ship bugs in product. So let me ask you, since Jordan, you're the big proponent of not breaking betas, if we had launched the thing in beta and it turns out there was some corner case because humans or devs are particularly terrible at testing their own code. So we missed some corner case. People used it in a way we didn't anticipate, and it caused a cluster crash. But we've already put it out in beta. You previously said we're not going to break the schema. We're going to fix the issue, right? And we'll find a way to roll forward, but not break that previous state.
So we have to deal with the persisted data, right? If persisting data that's shaped in this bad way always results in a broken thing, then that's a lot easier to reason about. We can say, like, stop letting people persist that bad thing in a new way and get themselves in a bad state. If we encounter existing data, return a better error, or don't panic, or like do something, behave as well as we can under the circumstances. I can't tell if what we're saying is people go to beta, don't understand that they are now responsible for dealing with the possibility of persisted beta data, which is rhymes and is hard to say. Like if that's an understanding gap, then that's something to improve. But just saying, well, the first one where we're enabled by default, we're just going to call it GA, but we'll still let people opt out of it because it's the first one we've released. So maybe they'll need to mitigate. Like, that just seems really strange to me.
I hear that, and I don't even disagree. I hadn't really thought about disableable GAs, but again, I think the perception is disabling a GA is a, oh my God, what did you do? Go fix this right now in a patch release, versus a beta enable disable state. Yeah, we'll get it in the next release. Like there's a perceptive thing there, but I will go back and repeat something I said earlier. If users had to explicitly choose to engage a beta feature, then a lot of my concerns actually go away because they're not going to accidentally use it. I see value in that intermediate state, but I don't want people accidentally stepping in it.
Like the point at which we say, we think this is good, like we've done our due diligence. As far as we know, it's tested and high quality, and like we think we're on the path to GA. We think it's good to enable by default, but we've never actually done it by default. Like, to me, that's what beta is for. I think that's a useful distinction. Like we shouldn't, if we're totally unsure about it, we're like, I don't know, see if it works for you. That still feels like alpha. So in my mind, I think we need a higher bar for beta, and then having beta still be enabled by default is reasonable to me.
And
so you're saying beta is GA but disableable.
Beta is, we think this is ready. If we don't get evidence to the contrary, then we would promote this to GA as is.
So I don't have a problem with that as an intermediate state. I just don't think that's what beta means in the vernacular.
I agree. So I would be okay with GA but disableable as the threshold for being on by default. But I don't believe that's the threshold we have now.
We can have an intermediate one between beta and GA that says preview, right? So if it's beta and it's switched on, then it's preview, right? So have another name, like, but the function is going to be the same, right? Like if you want to change the vernacular, like we can introduce a new term if you want.
So I'm just like mystified because where there's so much speculation versus like talking with 10,000 customers over and over and over again and having them scream in my ear. Customers know what beta is, like 100%. Like if a customer is deploying 10,000 clusters at JP Morgan, they sure as shit know what beta is. Like there is no question at all. Like they will let you know, and they will let you know what their expectations are. Right.
So you had those customers complain to you about, say, the client certificates used by the kubelet for all the releases that's been beta, including now. They're very concerned about certificate rotation in beta on the kubelet.
Yes. But other beta APIs, for example, they've complained about it forever. So they're aware of the expectations and guidelines that have existed. And so I think changing the expectations to a large community that has a significantly large deployment already, like half the infrastructure on the planet depends upon this now. So if you change the semantics or something, you should have a long tail of what the expected semantics are and make sure that you publicize that to the half the planet that now depends upon this. They do have an understanding of, or some understanding of the expectations around them. I think that's the key, is they have some understanding of the expectations. They want things promoted to GA as quickly as possible, but they understand that there is a life cycle to these things. Have we done a good job about promoting everything to GA with getting that feedback? No, but some yes, some things yes, some things no.
Antonio?
Antonio was next. Yeah.
No, I think that was Tim or Claire first.
A lot of the problems with the discussion around default on and default off stem from how difficult it is to enable a feature that's default off. Partly this is a cloud provider problem. I know on GKE we don't make it particularly easy. But also there's no support for dynamically toggling between those states. I'm curious if we had something like the proposal that Daniel Smith had started around making feature gates something that can be dynamically toggled in the API. If we had that, how would that change this conversation?
Being
Even more to the point, there was an idea of feature gates enable. Well, I mean, it wouldn't apply to all, but to name by namespace.
Yeah.
The people who end up who want to try the alpha and beta features which are not enabled already, I pasted a link where lots of EKS customers are asking for stuff. It'll be useful to them. It doesn't help the rest of the people.
I'm not confident it's useful to them. Like some of the risk in alpha features is that when you turn them on, you aren't guaranteed to be able to upgrade out of the state where those things are on. So you turn them on and now you depend on them,
right?
Because you did something with it, and
absolutely
you can't upgrade. And like from my perspective, like we even allow ours to be configured on the cluster. It's not hard, but we don't guarantee you can upgrade out of it, so nobody does it.
That is exactly why we haven't implemented it, right? So, and for all practical purposes, any EKS cluster is always a production cluster, right? So that's what we keep telling the people. So that is exactly the reason why we can't have a different level of a cross cluster that may break at any moment because of something that you're doing, and like we go trying to fix it.
Just for context, in GKE we do have a special kind of alpha cluster that we literally delete after 30 days. Like, so we're like, we just don't let people depend on it.
Yeah, we have something similar. It doesn't turn on everything, but it doesn't let you upgrade. And so it's dead ends. You get it until the point at which that release is over. And so you could serially install those things if you wanted to. And it's not like it's not supported, it's supported, but we don't guarantee upgrades, which is pretty painful.
Yeah, and the other thing that we tell EKS customers is like, hey, if you want to know which flags are on or off, go look at the corresponding Kubernetes release, and we do exactly the same, right? Like, so there's no difference between what you see in the community code versus what is here. So that is another thing that makes it easier for us to tell the story to the customers, saying, look, you're going to get exactly the same thing that is there in the community version.
Antonio.
Yeah, I just want to be sure that we are not trying to work around a developer people problem with a process problem. Because I think that, I don't know if we are agreeing that our beta is not really the best quality right now, and that we have kind of, I don't know, 30 or 40 features in beta right now, and that we have beta APIs like for more than 10 releases. And so if the goal of this proposal is to solve this problem, I think that is not the right approach, because the right problem is why these features are not finished. And I think that is because people is not working on them or finishing them. Or it's just good enough, I just ship it, people start to use it, and I'm not going to finish.
Yeah, so they have a beta that they have no intention of taking all the way to GA because it scratched their itch. What if they were never allowed to turn it on until it was ready?
Absolutely. Yeah,
That's-
+1 that.
I definitely see things that have made it to beta and then people walk away from it because it's on by default. Their customers can use it. Everybody's happy. They don't really have an incentive to come back and clean up.
So
Yeah.
what if we made a small change, not getting rid of beta entirely? What if instead we said we expect for all criteria to be beta criteria? There's no separate GA criteria anymore. Once you've met the threshold, you can then be enabled by default.
And I will add also another thing, David, is if in 3 or let's say, I'm making up the number, 3, 4 releases, you don't move the feature, we downgrade to alpha.
No, we can't do that. Like the whole point is once it's on by default and people are using it, we can't drop it.
We're not going to
Okay.
punish our users for our contributors.
Okay. So
If I like the idea of raising the bar of beta, so saying like no more low bar for beta, high bar for GA. Take all the things we think are required for GA and put that into the beta requirements. So you say you have to meet all the requirements we think are needed for this feature before you get to be beta on by default.
Yeah, just
then,
beta on by default, not beta by off, right? So there's 2 steps there.
Beta off by default is a weird state, and every time we've done it, I regret it.
Yes, I agree with that. I think if what we're defining here is GA but disableable, and I don't think
no, it's we think it's good. We don't have evidence from it being on in the wild yet that it's good, which goes to Tim St. Clair's point. Like, we don't know what we don't know until we get it out there. Like the requirements are the things we know while we're designing it and putting it together. But until it's on by default in the wild, we don't know what we don't know.
I still feel like there's a distinction without a difference there. Like we're saying it's GA quality to the best of our knowledge, to all of our test cases and all of the inputs that we've given it. It is done and we're ready. We're so ready for it that we're going to turn it on by default and let people accidentally use it. And that's GA. That's the definition of GA.
It's a person who's programming against the API. They're taking that into their own hands. If you're writing code and you're writing your YAML manifest and you're saying V1 beta 1 inside of your API, there's a known...
You're talking about API groups again. The focus here is really, I added a feature to a GA API. There is nothing in your YAML that says you're doing that.
Yeah, we talked about that up front. Like there's 3 categories. Like the beta endpoints, I think that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about beta fields and existing APIs or new behaviors that are like enabling via a gate.
I stuck a thing in PodSpec and people started using it because they saw it in the OpenAPI docs or they saw a blog post about it or they saw it on Twitter and they cut and pasted some YAML and they started using it. And it does something for them and then it explodes later. Like, what is our liability there? I think it's high.
So in this case, definitely we should hold a higher bar. I agree with you on that. Because it is part of a GA API.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. What I'm going to suggest is that somebody, probably David, since he initiated the conversation here, like maybe write out these categories, because it seems like in certain categories we're in agreement on, say, tightening the bar for beta, and there's other categories where, like, well, you know, maybe we're in agreement on different things and still have questions on other things. But like, I feel like, I think Jordan said this earlier, like we're talking about so many different issues and we conflate them and it gets confusing, and we need to like a really explicit bucketing of it, break down the problem, and then find the areas where we can already agree and start to make progress. So David, can we volunteer you for that, or does somebody else want to jump in and do it?
So I want something slightly different, maybe. So okay, sure. Writing up that particular aspect, Tim had a good write-up of those differences. One of the things that I'm interested in is, what if we keep beta the same and we do raise that bar for on by default to be all the requirements we want, are those requirements, that it needs to be ready. And I'm interested in like what people, I guess we're gonna have to figure out what ready means. Does it mean everything is done? Does it mean just
everything like conformance? I would say, right? Like, I mean, you should have the conformance tests written, but you can't mark them as conformance until.
But so that particular idea, does there seem to be enough traction on that one? Because I would say then I would probably choose something narrower to target. I would probably choose to target only case 2 and case 3. I wouldn't mess around with case 1 at all. Case 2 being adding a field to an existing GA API, and case 3 being I'm adding a piece of functionality that doesn't have any persisted data with it. And so I think I would narrow the proposal to that rather than trying to also mess with new APIs. And I see some nods. I think I got a nod from Tim and Dims and Jordan. That's probably enough to take the time and try to write that up and describe it.
I'm supportive. I think we have to define the intersection of features that touch both type 1 and type 2. In the thread, there was some discussion about whether you can have a GA feature gate with a beta API or not. So we can't completely ignore the type 1 case.
What if, well, I'll try to write something on phrase it, but what if I'm able to say like, no changes to that yet? Well, let's change the pieces where we all agree first, and then try to find the next set. Although I guess we probably all agree that it's not a good idea to have a GA feature built on a beta type.
Yeah, we have enough features that are strictly within categories 2 and 3. I think it'd be valuable to like define and improve this for those, and then take the ones that span. It's like, oh, you have a field in pod spec that requires some standalone API for the kubelet to do a thing. It's like, yeah, we've got those too. Let's think about that as a follow-up.
I'm fine with that. And I'll even hold my nose and stop complaining about the word beta for this, because we already have mechanisms around beta. I do think beta is the wrong word for it. And if the opportunity presents itself to change the vernacular, I would like to suggest that we consider it.
I want to be on record as agreeing with Tim here. I wasn't ready for it a year and change ago. I'm ready for it now. It is GA with less confidence. That's what that means.
Unproven GA that you can turn off if you have to.
A preview.
Build so much confidence. Beta is so succinct.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks everybody for a great discussion, and David, we'll look forward to seeing what you come up with there, and I think we made some progress.
Bye.
Awesome. Thanks everyone.